Good morning. I'm Jonathan Weiner, past president of the Society for Risk Analysis and a university fellow here at Resources for the Future, and delighted to welcome you to day 2 of our conference on new ideas for risk regulation. I won't repeat the entire welcomes that we gave yesterday, but for those of you who weren't here, you missed a terrific day and fascinating sessions and keynote luncheon speech by Sally Katzen. And I did want to just add a word of explanation for anyone who didn't catch why Sally Katzen mentioned that Cass Sunstein was originally to be the lunch speaker yesterday. And that's because, of course, Cass Sunstein has been nominated to be the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB, but not yet confirmed. And as such, his political handlers will not permit him to make a major address at an exciting conference like this. But we're all on the edge of our seats waiting for Cass's confirmation and for the promised new executive order on regulatory review, which will, again, frame many of the discussions that we will have today. I want to thank again Resources for the Future for co-sponsoring and hosting us here. It's been a great pleasure to work with all of them, scholars, staff, and we look forward to additional SRA-RFF joint efforts in the future. And I mentioned yesterday that we have a table outside for those of you who'd like to browse materials of the Society for Risk Analysis. Apparently those materials have been dwindling as some of us have been walking off with them. I know Rick Belzer, who's been staffing that, is probably frantically trying to find the last copy of the SRA journal, which I have purloined here, in order to show you that if you join the SRA, you'll receive a subscription to the journal, a subscription to our newsletter, invitation to attend our annual meeting, which will be this coming December 6th through 9th in Baltimore, where there will be additional sessions built around the same themes of today's conference on risk regulation, regulatory review, and oversight. You also stand the chance to win exciting awards from the SRA for your excellent work and network with colleagues from all around the world. So we do encourage you to browse the materials, to visit sra.org and join us. I'm delighted again to introduce Lisa Robinson, our conference chair. To introduce Alan Krupnick. Alan gets the pleasure of introducing Lisa. But to introduce Alan Krupnick, my longtime friend. I remember the first time that I ever spoke to Alan Krupnick. I think it was the first week that I was a young staffer in the federal government, and I called him up to ask him something, and he used some acronym I had never heard. And I said I didn't know what that acronym was, and he said, "Oh, you don't know such and such? All right." And then I got a sense of Alan's perspective on the world, and but it's been but then a little bit later, Alan and I were back to back senior staff at the Council of Economic Advisors, and it was a real pleasure to work with him. And thanks again to RFF for hosting us. So, Alan, thank you very much.
Jonathan, what was the acronym?
I don't remember it either.
It was actually CARB.
Oh, California Air Resources Board. Well, Jonathan stole my opening line too, because I'm once again following Jonathan as I followed him at the CEA at the end. Jonathan was at the end of the Bush 1 era and straddled the beginning of the Clinton administration, and then I came in that 93-94 period where healthcare was dominant, but the Superfund wars that as economists we lost under the Clinton administration was a dominant thing there. Also environmental justice, and also the rewriting of Executive Order 12291 was one of the main things that we had there. In fact, I remember we would have meetings in my office at the old executive office building to discuss the value of statistical life. We had all the agency economists in there coming in for weeks on end, talking about the way this should appear in the executive order. for a cost-benefit analysis. So it's quite an exciting time. So anyway, well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a senior fellow here at Resources for the Future. I'm also director of research for about 10 years now. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Phil Sharp, our president now at RFF, to come here. That, you know, it's all about the timing. And I want to say that Lisa Robinson had the timing of this conference right on the money. So we didn't know, I think, at the time that there would be this call from the Obama administration for comments on that executive order, and the fact that so many people here and are slogging through all these actually fascinating discussions is a real credit to Lisa's great timing. So with that, I just also wanted to thank Pete Nelson, who's out here. Pete's our director of communication, and he's been working hard with Lisa and his team as well to make this entire conference run smoothly. I hadn't heard his name before. So let's have look forward to a great four sessions today as well. 3?
4 plus Paul.
Well, of course, and my great friend and former boss Paul Portney will charge us up with his views on cost-benefit analysis later in the day. So, Lisa.
The funny thing about this is that when we first started planning this, people kept saying June was too late, that we really needed to have this conference by March because by then the new administration would be marching ahead, and little do we know. I, of course, was hoping that today would be the day that they released the new executive order and the CAS got confirmed, which would have been just perfect, but it didn't work out that well. Yesterday I went through all the different people who helped us do this, both in terms of enormous amounts of volunteer time and in terms of financial contributions. For those of you who missed that, you can watch it on the web. Can we get the agenda for today up on the screen? While he's doing that, I wanted to just go through a few housekeeping things. First is at the registration table where everybody came in, there's an evaluation form, and we'd really appreciate it if you'd fill out that form. It's an important part of SRA and RFF's process for thinking about what we did well and what we should do differently if we do this again. The second thing is that RFF is videotaping the sessions. They will be on the web, I think, within 3 days. Is that right? So for those of you who've spoken, you can watch yourself. For those of you who have friends that missed this, they can watch the sessions that they're interested in. We will also be posting speakers from the materials from the speakers. For those of you who are speaking and have not yet sent me the things that we have permission to post, you need to do that by tomorrow, because we hope to get all that material up on the web on Thursday. We hope to start getting it ready to get it up on the web on Thursday so that we can actually have it live within a week or so. The other thing is that we are working on a special issue of risk analysis. Given the amount of time it takes to write papers, get them peer-reviewed, and then get them published, I think it'll probably be sometime in late 2010. By the time the issue comes out. But as Jonathan says, if you all join SRA, you will get a copy of the issue for free. The rest of you can pay for the articles, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, today we're going to start off with a panel on what benefit cost analysis tells us, talking about its role in regulatory analysis and review. After a short break, we'll talk about how to incorporate equity considerations into those analyses. At lunch, we welcome Paul back, and he'll be talking about, again, the role of benefit cost analysis. Our final panel will look at the implications of behavioral economics for research on preferences stated in revealed preference studies. And then at the end of the day, Jonathan will conclude with a roundtable. They'll be talking about the future of regulatory oversight. With that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Joe, and we'll get going with the first panel. But thank you all.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. I'm Joe Cordes. I'm the current director of the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration at GW here in D.C., and happy to say that we are one of, I think, a relatively small number, actually, of public policy programs that has consistently taught a full semester course in benefit cost analysis, where the students actually have to do one at the end. So the panel, as the title indicates, is going to talk about the role of benefit cost analysis and regulatory analysis. Obviously, this fits very well with the themes of yesterday, where we know that the letter that was issued calling for a review specifically mentioned CBA as one of the things to look at. I think everybody's betting that it's going to remain as part of the process, but in modified form, and certainly the issues we're going to address in this panel and the next one are quite relevant to that. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first panelist to come up. This is James Hammett, who's professor of economics and decision sciences in the Department of Health Policy and Management at Harvard.
Good morning. So I'd like to also add my thanks to Lisa Robinson for spearheading the effort to pull together what's so far been a fabulous conference. And I look forward to even better discussions today. So what I want to talk about is positive and normative justifications for benefit cost analysis and the implications of the justification we have for doing these analyses for how we conduct them and how we interpret their results. So this could also be cast as description versus prescription. Conventional benefit cost analysis includes a mix of inputs from individuals and the public and from experts and science. So as benefit cost analysis is typically conducted, we take values of benefits and costs based on individual preferences of the affected public, and we conduct some sort of, quote, objective risk assessment and assessment of other consequences. Now, we all know well that individual behavior and perceptions often, or sometimes at least, conflict with what economic and other models suggest should be our perceptions and behavior. And for me, this is really the central question. To what extent are these conflicts due to errors that we as individuals make all the time? And to what extent are they due to the fact that the economic and other models are oversimplified and leave out stuff that actually is important to people and ought to be included in the model? So the question for an applied topic like benefit cost analysis is, how should we incorporate departures between what people believe and do from what our model assumes they believe and do? And you could also cast this in sort of broad terms as a theory of governance. Do we want a government that kind of gives the public, we the public, what we think we want, kind of leading? Politicians are sometimes criticized for following the results of polls, but that would be a very populist form, perhaps. Or do we want a government that's more paternalistic, that exercises real leadership in taking us in some direction that we don't actually think we want, although with hindsight we may recognize we did want? So I'd like to, one example here that highlights this tension was a two-page paper written by Paul Portney, and so I'm delighted that Paul's here, Trouble in Happyville. And he says, he poses this problem. You are the director of environmental protection in the town of Happyville. All 1,000 residents of Happyville believe that a naturally occurring contaminant in the drinking water is carcinogenic, and they are each willing to pay the treatment cost of $1,000 per capita to reduce this concentration. You've consulted the 10 leading risk analysts in the world, and every one of them agrees that while they could never prove that this contaminant is harmless, each of them would stake his or her reputation on the fact that it is harmless. You have skillfully communicated the best science and risk assessments to the public, and they just don't trust government, and they still want the treatment. They're still willing to pay for it. So what should you do? So I think that's a pretty stark version of this. Okay, so if you look in textbooks about benefit cost analysis, I think the justifications you will see are some mix of these three. One is the Kaldor-Hicks compensation test, that we value benefits to people who are better off because of a rule or a project by their willingness to pay, harms by the willingness to accept compensation of the people who are harmed. We net those out. If net benefits are positive, that means that the winners could compensate the losers with money such that we'd have a Pareto improvement. Now, the bite here is the claim that compensation is not actually necessary. We should still go ahead with this project. And the reason we don't want to compensate project by project is we can do better by reallocating resources within the society through more direct mechanisms like tax and transfer programs. So this really focuses on separating the size of the social pie from the allocation of it, efficiency and distribution. A different justification is more utilitarian, saying we want to maximize the sum of utility in the society. We don't know exactly how to measure utility, but one proxy for it could be monetary value of benefits and harms to the affected people. That immediately invites the suggestion that if you think a dollar provides more utility to a poor person than the rich person, maybe we should weight the benefits and costs by the income or other characteristics of the affected population. In the medical world and some parts of public health, cost-effectiveness analysis using quality-adjusted life years is very common. And I think part of the attraction for that is people have the intuitive sense that a quality-adjusted life year is a better, more interpersonally comparable measure of an increment in utility than is a dollar. Another argument for benefit cost or cost-effectiveness analysis is just consistency, that if we adopt a policy of deciding largely on the grounds of one of these forms of analysis, on average, the people who gain, the people who are harmed for any particular decision will not be the same, and so in the long run, everybody will be better off from a policy of deciding this way rather than some other policy. And that's plausible, but of course the question is compared with what alternative decision-making paradigm. We can certainly imagine situations where you have the classical smoke-filled room with the politically connected interests making decisions that might be worse for the population as a whole. But that doesn't mean there isn't some other system that might be better for the population as a whole. Okay, in thinking about social policy, the two big fundamental questions are: what is good for an individual? If we're trying to improve somebody's well-being, what do we mean by that? And a sub-question here, in economics we often talk about individual, but do we really mean a family or a household or some community or something not a literally independent, autonomous person? No man is an island. And then the distributional question: when does providing more good to some people justify imposing harm or foregoing the opportunity to provide good to other people? In terms of defining good for an individual, one answer is consumer sovereignty. Good is whatever people think is good for them. That's associated with neoclassical economics, of course. Another answer, or set of answers, would be things like well-being, which is not necessarily the same as preference satisfaction, or capabilities for living a meaningful life, or a moral life as following the dictates of a religion or other ethical theory. Sort of variety of answers to that question. In terms of distribution, an important question is how can we measure trade-offs between people? Standard economics assumes there is no objective way to say who gets more incremental utility or suffers more incremental utility loss from any change. And think of pain of some injury. Who hurts more? We have no way to answer that question objectively. Utilitarianism basically assumes we do have a way to measure utility in an interpersonally comparable way, or at least we can agree on a way to measure our proxy for utility. And the methods that are actually used in practice, the common ones at least, are money and things like quality-adjusted life years. So, to be clear here, when I'm talking about positive versus normative justifications for analysis, the positive question, a positive analysis, seeks to answer the question, if this policy were adopted, does there exist some set of compensation payments such that a Pareto improvement would be achieved, meaning everybody in the society would think themselves better off with the policy and the compensation than without? That obviously rests on the idea of consumer sovereignty, and the distributional question is handled through money. A normative analysis would seek to answer the question, is the affected population better off even if they don't perceive themselves to be better off? Because we have norms that conflict with people's own preferences. That's the whole point. Okay. So these two different schools of thought could lead to different implications for how we do the analysis and what we think we've learned of it. I list here a whole bunch of areas of divergence between the positive and normative models for individual good. So there are things like we're susceptible to framing effects, and by and large, framing effects, I think, are simply errors that we don't want to incorporate, but it can take a long time to figure out when we're suffering from a framing effect and when we're not. Distinctions between acts of omission and commission. Do we actually value those differently or not? Do we want to value them differently? Disparity between estimates of willingness to pay and willingness to accept. Hyperbolic discounting versus exponential discounting. And I'm going to run through quickly the points highlighted in red. So one is risk perception, qualitative risk attributes. There's lots of evidence that in perception of risk and concern about risk, qualitative attributes like dread and uncertainty seem to be quite important. There's, to my mind, only limited evidence that these attributes affect willingness to pay, and I don't think they seem to affect willingness to pay very much, but the studies here are all stated preference studies subject to their limitations. Other qualitative attributes that seem to matter to us are whether, like a chemical is, quote, natural or synthetic, matters a lot, independent of toxicity testing, at least to some people. There's a lot of concern about genetically modified foods in Europe, more in Europe than in the U.S. Is that something that should matter to people, or is that a framing or some sort of other error? Another topic is when we estimate willingness to pay to reduce risk reduction, with stated preference studies, we usually find the willingness to pay for a bigger risk reduction is larger than for a smaller risk reduction, but not proportionally larger. So if you take this as an accurate measure of preference, what it means is that an initial risk reduction is worth something, and an additional risk reduction is worth something less. In other words, two actions that each reduce risk by delta R would be valued more than one action that reduces risk by 2 delta R plus a little bit. Is that really what we believe, or is that a mistake? Is that an error? You could think of maybe what we value as partly the act of reducing the risk, and secondly, the magnitude of the risk reduction as a way to reconcile this. There's a lot of evidence people don't like ambiguous probabilities. You can think of this as when there's a risky situation, there's already the risk of the bad outcome. In addition, there's the risk of facing a bad probability distribution, makes it even worse. So should we take greater precaution when the probabilities are uncertain than when they're not? Well, I think we should think carefully before doing that. Maybe we should, but one partial answer to the question was contained in a very nice paper written by Richard Zeckhauser and Nick Nichols some time ago called Perils of Prudence, which shows if you have a policy of taking greater precaution against the more uncertain risks, in the long run you will increase the probability of suffering bad outcomes compared with expected value decision making. Another answer is to recognize that when things are uncertain, there's a value of information, a value to learning, and may be worth trying the uncertain option. It may turn out that it's much safer than the more certain option, and so we can benefit from that rather than shunning uncertainty. Information disclosure. So in standard economics, provision of information is assumed to be not bad. People can always ignore it and could be beneficial. But we know all of us can be misled by information. There's a huge industry called advertising that spends a lot of effort trying to lead us in various directions through providing even accurate information. Some of it's not, of course. It may cause us to overemphasize attributes that seem salient. And so this suggests that a policy of prohibiting disclosure of accurate information may sometimes be beneficial. in law, there's the concept of the probative versus prejudicial value of evidence that I think is one way to think about this question. On the distributional side, many of us in the room are well aware of fights over adjusting VSL for age or life expectancy of the affected population. And also, it's clear that value of statistical life increases with income and wealth, but in practice, that's always ignored, as far as I know, within a society. That clearly violates the positive justification for benefit cost analysis. We're using a VSL for people that is not our best estimate of their valuation. So to conclude, implications for benefit cost analysis, if we have the positive justification, we're trying to predict whether the affected population would find itself better off if appropriate compensation were made. And that implies what we want to do is measure individual preferences and perceptions as accurately as possible and recognize differences in valuation by age, sex, income, anything else that matters. Don't suppress them. So that is a scientific enterprise susceptible to empirical testing. So to go back to Happyville, that says you should clean up the water. That's what people want. The normative model, the question instead is to try and evaluate whether the affected population would be better off. I'm not really sure if this means everybody in the population or the population as a whole, perhaps, even if they don't perceive themselves to be. So it raises questions of how do we measure individual good and social welfare. We have to face those questions. And it also suggests to me that possibly analysts are just some other interest group. We have our conception of what good and social welfare is, and we are arguing for that. So thank you.
Our next speaker will be Professor Jonathan Barron from the Department of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. It's only appropriate that we follow this presentation with a psychologist, I think. So,
yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, James, for really setting the stage very well for what I wanted to talk about, which is to advocate a what I call utilitarian decision analysis, although you don't need to use it all at once. Decision analysis, it was mentioned yesterday, and it isn't clear that everyone's on the same page about what it means. It's this tradition of analyzing decisions. Howard Rafa was largely responsible for it, but there are other people that involves actually trying to measure utilities in the sense of good, and then multiply by probabilities when relevant and add up the probabilities. And there's also a form of it called multi-attribute utility theory that leads to measurement of utility when you can divide things into attributes. The usual application of this, for example, in the attribute version, sort of allows people to count anything as an attribute. And I'm calling this utilitarian because I want to limit it to consequences. That's usually the way it's done. But some people want to stick in fudge factors for their ethical intuitions and things like that. And I want to argue for a kind of pure form, very much like what James was talking about is the normative approach. And I'll justify that in a minute. So I think James sort of said all this, but I want to give the standing on one. The second line there is the standing on one foot argument for why you might want to do this, which is that if you can do this correctly as a way of doing an analysis of decisions, it maximizes good because that's what utility is. That's what it's supposed to be. And anything else is going to make someone worse off without making anybody else better off to the same degree. So at least by omission, you're going to be harming somebody. So now this is very controversial, and in 15 minutes I can't say more. So, and as James pointed out, it's used in medicine a lot more than in other places. I think this approach, sometimes in the form of cost-effectiveness analysis, where you take money and separate that out, and then use this kind of analysis to look at the benefits. And then use some other kind of analysis to look at the costs. That's fine. In the examples I'm going to give, I'm going to talk about using money as one of the attributes we value, but nothing I say is special to money. All this stuff works with other attributes too. Although this is a kind of normative approach, the input to it has to come from human judgments, because in many of these cases we can't get measures of any other kind of measures of utility except for judgments. There are different kind of judgments. You can have direct judgments. You can infer judgments from people's decisions, from real life decisions, or from hypothetical decisions. I think it's an empirical question as to which of these is best, and that's what I've spent a lot of time studying. And one way to study it is to find out if the methods are internally consistent and ignore irrelevant information and pay attention to relevant information. And to defend the normative view, I don't need to say this because James has already said it, that if, I think the argument here is that we really want a second opinion. We don't want to just get a reflection of people's state of what people think they want. Once we have the second opinion, we can then explore differences about why people don't like that opinion and see what we left out of the analysis or what we did wrong or whatever, or why the people are wrong in terms of valuing their own self-interest. And the examples, and the point I want to make in the next few examples is to say that when we elicit judgments, in order to get rid of a lot of biases that distort these judgments, we may have to be paternalistic and abstract the essentials of the situation. And this may mean giving subjects in our experiments and so on less information rather than more, because the information may deceive them or mislead. I'll give an example of that. I hit the wrong button. Okay, so one big problem in all this kind of analysis is what economists call scope effects. Psychologists often call them range effects. They're all over, and and the proportionality effect that Hammett talked about is an example. People tend to be relatively insensitive to the magnitude of outcomes, whether it's monetary outcomes or other outcomes, depending on how you ask the question. One way to avoid this is to use conjoint analysis, where you give people this has been around for a long time, but you give people a multi-attribute stimulus. Here's one with 3 attributes, and ask them to rate it on a 1 to 10 scale. And from the ratings and from various mathematical assumptions, you can infer, you give people a lot of these, like 50 or so in a series. And from their ratings, you can infer how much utility they would, how each of these variation in each attribute would affect their utility. That method is more sensitive than other methods to the magnitude of effects. But it's not perfect. Oh gosh, I'm hitting the wrong button again. Here's another way to do it that we discovered 13 years ago, and no one's ever tried in real life yet. And that is to ask people. The trouble is that people, if you ask people, how much would you? Okay, suppose there's small amounts of a cancer-causing chemical in your drinking water. It has a 50% cure rate. It can be removed by a filter, which must be replaced once a year. Now, the usual way of asking the question leaves out what's in italics, or it's not in italics. Okay, it's how much would you pay per year? How much would you pay for each cancer case prevented, without the per year? And for a filter that removes the chemical, if the rate is 10 per million, or how much would you pay if it's 1 per million? Often people give very similar answers to those two questions. They might differ a little bit, but not nearly as much as they should if you really want to find out how much do they pay per case. The way to avoid this problem is to ask them the question per case, as it's written there. How much would you pay per year for each cancer case prevented? And then if you give them this second question later, how much would you pay for a year for a filter that removes it for 1 per million, they're entirely consistent. So this method of asking about per unit totally removes the insensitivity to magnitudes, although it, of course, gives different judgments from what they give if you ask for the 10 cases per year. Another phenomenon, and this is why when I talk about missing information, judgments get it's easy to find that judgments of willingness to pay are contaminated by what people think the costs are. And we did an experiment on this, asking people things like, how much would you pay, these were students, to reduce the rate of violent crime on campus from 50 to 25 crimes per year for 50,000 students. Now, if you just ask that, if we then say, suppose to do this, you have to increase the number of campus police from 50 to 100, or you increase the police from 50 to 200. This is between subjects. Different subjects get different things. The subjects who get the 50 to 200 are willing to pay more, even though we're trying to get them to evaluate the consequence and not the method. In contingent valuation studies, people often ask, when you ask them the question in an open-ended way, they often say, well, what does it cost? So an easy way to avoid this is simply not tell them how it's done. That's what I mean by withholding information. So you really want to get them to value the consequences, ask them about the consequences, and strip away everything else. And that has to work, of course. Here's another example. James talked about omission bias as one of the act-omission distinction. I call it a bias. From a utilitarian point of view, acts and omissions don't really differ much. So it turns out that you can eliminate this bias by throwing away the information, again, about how the outcome was reached and getting people to focus on the outcome. So here's a study I did. Treatment A cures 50 people out of 100 who come in with a condition, and it leads to no other conditions. Treatment B cures 80, but it leads to another condition in 20. And X and Y are equally serious. So the difference between A and B is that B is causing harm through omission, but the total outcome is better for option B. Many people will choose option A because they don't want to cause harm through action. But you can debias this by simply by adding the extra sentence at the end. In other words, treatment A leads to 50 people with condition X and nobody with any other condition, and treatment B leads to 20 people with condition X and 20 people with condition Y, which is equally serious. Now, which treatment would you choose? And people now choose treatment A, treatment B. But then the critical thing is you ask them, do you think that's a fair summary? And almost everyone said yes. So you can really get rid of a lot of these effects by, of course, if you ask them this right away without giving them the mechanism of how this is arrived at, but just the consequence, it avoids the problem. Here's another example. There are, I think, biases associated with trying to preserve equality or equity. So here's a similar case. A condition has two forms. Each week, 100 people can come in with form X, 100 with form Y. And you have to choose a treatment for everybody before you know what condition that person has. That isn't in the treatment A cures 80 of the 100 with form X and 40 of the 100 with form Y. Treatment B cures 50 of the 100 with form X and 50 of the 100 with form Y. In other words, and of course, if you ask that without the last sentence, people prefer treatment B because it's fair. And in other studies, I've shown that people choose treatment B even if the people don't know what condition they have and never will find out. So this fairness intuition extends pretty widely. But if you summarize this by saying, in other words, treatment A cures 120 people with a condition and treatment B cures 100 people with a condition, then people like treatment A. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. Okay, that's right. Okay. Sometimes you want to take inequality into account, as James said. And one way you can do that is by direct judgments. in this. So here's an example I just made up. This isn't a real experiment. But, you can describe, and I even have a misspelling. John is single and lives, so you can give people little scenarios about people and ask them, what? Okay. So the idea is to give people descriptions of two different people. One's rich, one's poor. Suppose you have to divide an extra $10,000 between these two so that the benefits would be the same. Or another way you could ask it is, suppose you give $5,000 to John. How much money would you have to give to Jake so as to give him the same benefit? It would be less, actually, most likely. Or you could, another way to do this is to ask, anyway, there's lots of ways to do this. So sometimes direct judgments of comparing intervals helps. So to conclude, we can eliminate, I've sort of said all this. Sometimes, one more point I want to make on this slide because I'm out of time, but it may be that in applying these kinds of methods, we don't want to give a short questionnaire to 5,000 people, but to rather spend a lot more time with fewer people so as to be able to check the consistency of their judgments. That's what decision analysts do. It's still possible to sample different populations, men, women, rich, poor, different ethnic groups, and so on. But the statistical power of large samples may be wasted when you have tremendous error in the method itself. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Our next panelist is David Meltzer, who's both a physician and an economist, and has an appointment in 3 departments at the University of Chicago, the Medical School, Department of Economics, and the Harris School of Public Policy. David.
Great, thanks. I'm going to talk today about some work that we've done on self-selection and cost effectiveness. And I'm going to begin by describing a little bit of the theory and background of this idea. And then I'm going to focus for a while on a medical application, which is to cost effectiveness in diabetes, and some results that we have about how education actually alters the process of self-selection. So I'll run through the methods, results, conclusions, and I'll end with some implications that include talking about how I think this might be relevant for environmental cost effectiveness, which I know is an interest of many people here, obviously. So let me begin with a little background on the idea of self-selection. I think, as this group knows, cost effectiveness analysis is often used to assess the benefits of health-promoting interventions, whether in a medical or environmental context relative to cost. And QALYs are often used to do this, and you calculate the cost per QALYs and compare it to some threshold. Now, traditional models for doing this typically use preferences or utilities that average across individuals. But it's well recognized, particularly in the medical literature, that these utilities can vary across individuals or populations, and these can influence the expected benefits of treatment. And so cost effectiveness can vary by populations and subgroups, and people often use the term preference-sensitive conditions in medical cost effectiveness analysis. None of this is new. What I'm going to emphasize today, though, is that preferences can also affect choices, and these choices in turn influence exposure. So, for example, in the medical context, patients whose preferences favor a treatment are going to be more likely to choose it. And the question is, how do you need to think about that in the context of cost-effectiveness analysis? And in the medical context, the simple result is that this self-selection can improve cost-effectiveness of a medical treatment compared to traditional models that neglect it. And at the end, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how you think about this in the context of environmental interventions. I think it's more complicated. So here's the sort of theoretical framework, in a sense, that I used to think about this. We have costs on the y-axis, effectiveness on the x-axis, things to the right benefit you, things to the left harm you, things that are on the top half cost money. In the south east, you have things that are clearly dominant. They're more effective and save money. In the northwest, things that are clearly dominated, they cost more and make you worse off. Most of the action is in the northeast quadrant, where things cost more money and are beneficial. The question is, are they cost effective? That CE line is a cost effectiveness threshold. Above it, to the left, you say things are beneficial but not cost effective. Below it, you say they're cost effective. The little blue dots around there are all different people, and it reflects the heterogeneity in their preferences based on how they feel about, say, the benefits of the treatment, the side effects. Traditionally, what's done in cost effectiveness is you average over all those blue dots to get a point like M, and you say on average we'd say this is not a cost-effective intervention. The question, though, is what about these people to the left, the orange people? They're all being harmed by this. If they figure that out and say no, that point M is no longer the logical point to say this is cost-effective or not because they've all dropped out. In that case, you end up with a point like M prime where now something becomes cost-effective. So this is perfect self-selection. And if that were the case, you'd want to use data not on everyone, but just on the people who would actually choose it. The real world isn't that simple. People maybe on the right tend to choose a little more and continue to be blue dots, but some people on the left choose it even though it's harmful, and some people who would have benefited don't choose it. What's the consequence of that? Well, we don't know exactly. It's an empirical question, but we think it's going to move somewhere to the right. The question is, how do you account for that? So the example we've used is diabetes in the elderly. Guidelines clearly say that intensive lowering of glucose is good for younger patients. It's unclear if it's beneficial in older patients. They have shorter life expectancy anyway. The side effects of treatment may dominate. And in fact, some of the models of this even suggest that it may be harmful. And we know a lot of older patients refuse intensive therapy. And all this suggests self-selection may matter in this context, particularly by age, as the older patients say no to this. The other thing I just want to sort of talk about theoretically before I move on to data is the sort of role in health. And there's a large economics literature that I think many people in the audience know and others understand intuitively that education can be related to health, but in particular the idea that education can make you more efficient in producing health. So the knowledge that people have through education helps them make better choices about what to eat or what treatments to choose, those sorts of things. And one mechanism that one could think about that really hasn't been highlighted is the idea that education could help self-selection. In other words, that educated people are better at choosing the things that are most consistent with what they want. And the question is, does this play into roles like this? And it may matter for environment as well. So basically what we did is we interviewed a whole bunch of patients with diabetes. We collected all their data on their preferences, how they valued the treatment states of conventional versus intensive lowering of glucose, intensive meaning just taking a lot more insulin and checking finger sticks a lot, and also all the side effects. And we used that in essence to locate all those dots on the diagram in various spots. And then we just looked at people's treatment choices. Did they end up being a blue or an orange dot in the sense of choosing it? And then we calculated cost effectiveness. We fed it all through a model to calculate QALYs. We did a bunch of analyses stratified by intensive versus conventional therapy for contrasting all patients getting these one or the other alternative versus perfect self-selection, empirical self-selection, and then we stratified also by things like age and by education. These are just some demographics of our sample, very diverse racially, which was by construction. And this is what happens if you do the standard cost-effectiveness analysis that you'd see in any medical journal. You feed the whole population through there. It turns out that intensive therapy for diabetes is harmful on average. The side effects dominate the benefits, at least in this older population. These are the actual dots that generate this, stratified by the orange and blue as before, with the people on the right benefiting. And it turns out that if you average over all of this, you end up in the harmful category. But if you look, of course, among those who benefit, it's beneficial. This shows the results of that. And you can see that in the top, actually, in the second panel we've added now, that actually for the vast majority of people, this is beneficial. And in fact, it's highly cost-effective at about $20,000 per QALY. So there is indeed real heterogeneity in the potential this could be cost-effective. What happens when you look at how people really choose it? You get a pattern like this. You can see the blue dots tend to be on the right. And when you actually do the cost-effectiveness analysis, with accounting for behavior, you discover that, in fact, among the people who are choosing this 189 people at the bottom, it's actually beneficial and cost-effective, completely opposite of the standard analysis that would be published, for example, in JAMA or something like that. When you stratify by age, it's quite interesting. You see, again, in every age group, it's harmful. As you go to the older age groups, it becomes less harmful in terms of QALYs, but that's only because people don't have so long to live. And when you actually deal with self-selection, what you discover is that that's not at all the case. It becomes somewhat less cost-effective with age, but it's cost-effective at every age. Why? Because only the people who are benefiting are choosing that. And in fact, when you look at the fraction of people choosing it, you discover as you go from 40 to 40 to 70 and 70 above, the fraction of people choosing intensive therapy fall. So that self-selection is essentially compensating for declining benefits. This is the same set of results you saw before about the full population, perfect self-selection, and empirical self-selection, only now it's stratified by high school graduates and less than high school education. And it's quite interesting. If you look at the left panel there, what you see is that the results, for example, for perfect self-selection are really quite similar between the two. 21,000 versus 19,000 for this average benefit among the people who would benefit, and a similar fraction, 74 and 70, actually benefiting. What's fascinating is when you go to the bottom panel, empirical self-selection. Among the less educated people, intensive therapy isn't cost-effective. Among the educated people, it is cost-effective. Why? Because the less educated people essentially are getting the treatment almost at random, because they're not getting, I think, this sort of more informed decision of what the value is for them. Whereas the educated people, if they don't want it, are just saying no. There are a number of limitations to this in terms of building the model, whether you really believe in utilities. Assumes that patient utilities are relevant for cost effectiveness. We can talk about that later if people want. And this looks at cost effectiveness only in one context. And of course, the cost effectiveness of diabetes therapy might be different if it were used differently. So let me just very quickly run through sort of 4 sets of implications. First, and I think most obviously, the results of these standard cost effectiveness analyses can clearly be misleading. And this distinction between perfect and empirical self-selection is potentially very important empirically. And so when you build these sort of modeling approaches to cost effectiveness, you really want data on who's going to use a treatment. The second thing is that accounting for self-selection can give you a framework to value guidelines, decision aids, or improve doctor-patient communication, for example, that can make care more consistent with patient preferences. And there's a big literature in the medical context of thinking about decision aids. So in this case, we have a bunch of patients who are making mistakes, as shown by the scattering of the blue and the orange dots. And what decision aids could do, for example, is take some of these people on the left who are being harmed and get them to stop choosing, or take some of the people on the right who weren't choosing it and get them to choose it. You can actually add up the benefits of each of those changes in effectiveness and cost. You can convert it into a measure of the value of decision aid, either with cost benefit or net health benefits. And this gives you an idea, for example, in the context of prostate cancer, where basically the value of the best individual level therapy is 100 times the value of the best average therapy for men. It's because there's such heterogeneity in preferences. You can also use this framework to think about co-payment systems. I'm going to skip over it a little bit for time, but basically the motivation for co-payment is to get these people with very small values to back off. It turns out that can improve cost effectiveness, of course. The reason that's so important is that because of things like moral hazard, if you look at the value of individualized therapy and things like prostate cancer treatment, it turns out that giving people better information can actually make it much worse, because you have men choosing treatments with very little actual benefit for them, only because they're insensitive to the costs of those treatments. So this is where I want to conclude, and this is I think most relevant for environmental issues. So I think one of the things that self-selection can do is give you insight into policy making for voluntary versus involuntary interventions. So most medical interventions really are voluntary. So in this case, self-selection is going to improve value versus population estimates. When you think about many environmental policy and safety regulations, a lot of these are more involuntary. So you have to breathe the same air, you have to follow the rules. And as long as these harms of pollution or the safety risk or of regulation are non-selectively distributed, you really do have sort of a different set of issues. But there are a couple of things to think about that I think make this a little more subtle and interesting. One is this question of sort of different standards for environmental regulation. So traditionally we've had sort of a very high value of life in environmental analyses, which implies a low threshold for regulation. And this, to some extent, accounts for the unavoidable nature of the threats to health with environmental challenges. And this is, of course, reasonable if environmental harms aren't selectively avoidable. But the point is it's less reasonable if regulatory harms are also not selectively avoidable. And examples would be emission standards which raise the cost of driving but without public transportation, or mandatory seat belts or airbags that you can't disconnect, or these new asthma inhalers that protect the environment but may actually cause people's asthma not to be as well treated. So a better approach in all of these things really is to model selection and use a common threshold for all these decisions rather than trying to sort of trick the analysis by using a different standard. And then the last thing I wanted to conclude with is, is it really right to think about these environmental burdens as unavoidable? Maybe they are avoidable. For example, you could stay home on days with bad air quality. You can buy water filters. You can not eat fish when pregnant. the point is, these are still costly, but they're less so than the adverse health effects, and the cost may decline over time. And you can also think about, for example, targeted and general education as a way to help people mitigate these risks. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for bad air, bad water, and poisoned fish, okay? But what I am advocating for is accounting for the extent to which they are avoidable when prioritizing them relative to other environmental threats that truly are unavoidable. And I think the general idea is that if you build self-selection and behavior into these frameworks, you can come up with a much richer way of understanding the real consequences of policies. Conclusions, I think accounting for self-selection really matters in cost-effectiveness, and these cost-effectiveness analyses based on models need to measure choices and then account for self-selection. And I think it's really worth thinking about education itself as an important modifier of cost-effectiveness and, in fact, an intervention. So, thanks.
And our fourth and final panelist of this session is Maureen Crocker, who's a senior fellow here at RFF and in the Department of Economics at the University of Maryland.
Okay, well, thanks to Lisa very much for inviting me to speak here. First, let me apologize for changing the title of the talk. The talk is going to be, What Should Benefit Cost Analysis Tell Us? And the reason I've changed it actually is to come back and address the question that Jim posed at the beginning of this session and when he put this session together. And Jim asked the question, what does benefit cost analysis tell us? And he basically proposed two answers. One thing it could tell us is what people think would make them better off. In other words, in Happyville, you actually go ahead and you treat the water. And he described this as the positive or descriptive approach. And against this, he contrasts the notion of the normative approach. In other words, benefit cost analysis should tell us what would make people better off and what they should prefer. What I'm going to talk about is really my take on these two perspectives. And you may disagree with what I'm going to say, but I hope it will get some discussion going. I think in ways this is a Hobson's choice. When we look at the positive approach, in ways it sounds good, it sounds scientific, but the context in which I want to discuss this is really health and safety regulations of the type that the U.S. EPA has to issue. For example, the regulation of 187 air toxics under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act, or setting tailpipe emission standards. Situations that involve a lot of, technical knowledge about health effects, and where one of the reasons actually for regulating in the first place is the fact that people do not have specialized knowledge that would necessarily enable them to avoid certain risks themselves, as David actually suggested a few minutes ago. For me, frankly, the positive approach is a non-starter. It's an approach that would allow subjective risks to rule, and I really think, we don't, base our space program on a poll in which we ask people what's the distance from the Earth to the Moon, and then we actually, we take the results of the poll and we use it. I think that in the same sense, when we're talking about the regulation of air toxics or taking the sulfur out of gasoline, that the positive approach, at least in its extreme form, is a non-starter. On the other hand, when you talk about the normative approach, what people should prefer, it sounds really, big brother, and it has a lot of negative connotations. So I think you also have to ask the question, what are you going to do with this benefit cost analysis? If the idea was this was going to dictate regulatory outcomes, the middle bullet, then I think you would definitely shy away from the normative approach. But if the goal is really to inform decision makers and also the public, then I think I really come down more on the normative side, although I have some caveats here. Okay, so I'm going to ask, what should benefit cost analysis tell us? Okay, so in my view, it should identify efficient but also inefficient policies, assuming people are well informed or about objectively measured risks. So basically, this is arguing for the damage function approach, which EPA uses, where risks are measured by risk assessors. this business of people being well informed and asking and incorporating people's preferences, but about things about which they're well informed, I think says something about how we want to do valuation, and I will discuss that. I think that benefit cost analysis shouldn't be the sole criterion for making regulatory decisions, and equity and distributive considerations matter. They're going to be discussed a lot in the next panel, but I do want to talk about, in a benefit cost analysis, what we perhaps should or shouldn't ask people to value if we want to incorporate equity into a benefit cost analysis. And finally, I think that benefit cost analysis really does identify situations where people really do have to make equity efficiency trade-offs. That's one of the reasons, actually, that I've chosen the example of regulating hazardous air pollutants, which is what I'm going to use in the talk. Okay. So what does my view imply about how you should conduct a benefit cost analysis? Well, it does imply you should use the damage function approach and separate risk assessment from valuation. It also, as I said, and we'll go into detail on this, affects what people should be asked to value. I think valuation methods should demonstrate that people understand what they're valuing. What I'm about to say may be controversial, but I think that this really does give the nod to stated preference approaches, where it is actually easier to test whether people do understand what they're valuing, whether they're making consistent decisions, and where you can hopefully, as Jonathan Barron told us, use approaches that would eliminate or reduce people's biases or misperceptions of what they're valuing. In the case of something like hazardous air pollutants, people have suggested that you could look at property value studies. There have been many studies that look at the impact of changes in the emissions under the toxic reliefs inventory on property values, and also that look at the impact of Superfund cleanups on property values. I would say that that's a situation where you don't want to use these unless you can actually demonstrate what it is these are capturing. And finally, in terms of documenting benefits across people in different social groups, different income groups, the issue here is going to be what it is we ask people to value. Do we actually ask people to value some measure of equity, such as a Gini coefficient or an Atkinson measure? Okay. So I think everyone here, or most people here, are really familiar with the damage function approach, so we'll go through this fairly fast. But in the case of the regulations we're going to talk about, that is the control of air toxics, we're really talking about risk assessors looking at the link from emissions to ambient air quality, to population exposures, to health impacts. And economists, of course, are the ones who then try to value these health endpoints, which are, we're going to focus actually on cancer cases avoided. The ideal is to look at what people would pay for these changes in health risks, again, assuming they understand them. And sometimes we're forced to use lower bound estimates. And indeed, this is a normative approach in Jim's terminology. We're measuring benefits associated with objectively measured risks, not people's risk perceptions. It's not normative, though, in the sense that we're saying this is what has to be the regulatory outcome. Okay. The National Scale Air Toxics Assessment Database, the NATA database, is an excellent tool that's been developed by OAQPS that describes people's exposure to toxic air pollutants and consequent health effects. The 1999 version of this, which describes effects of the census tract level, is on the web. The 2006 version of this is going to come out soon and is going to actually look at risks at a much finer level. And what's been done here is to actually look at the impact of emissions of 177 toxic air pollutants using dispersion models, looking at the impact on ambient pollution levels, using models of activity patterns to calculate population exposures, using both toxicological and epidemiological studies when available to calculate lifetime cancer risks for 87 hazardous air pollutants, and this information could be used to value changes in exposure to hazardous air pollutants, changes in hazardous air pollutant emissions, and if you did it using the damage function approach, you would actually use cancer risk valuation studies, either stated or revealed preference ones. So before we get too much into this, in terms of sort of important facts here about hazardous air pollutants, I think it has to be admitted that the lifetime cancer risks, as they're documented in this database, are generally small. At the census tract level, if you look at the 95th percentile of lifetime cancer risks from HAPS, we're talking about a lifetime risk of about 2 in 10,000, okay, a lifetime cancer risk. On the other hand, people are concerned because the distribution of these risks is uneven. You're going to see a map that shows the risks at the county level from the 1999 database on the next slide. You'll see there's great geographic variation here, but there is a lot of concern that the most exposed people are low-income groups, minorities, and so forth. So we have clear equity issues here. This is the map of cancer risks at the county level, and I should admit or emphasize that at smaller levels, the per person risks can be higher than this, but basically what you're seeing here is those darkest levels are risks, median lifetime risks at the county level of 1 in 10,000 or greater than 1 in 10,000. Okay, so you can see that the pattern of risks is quite diverse. We can't look exactly here at distributions by income or other factors, but that could be measured. Okay, so what can benefit cost analysis actually tell us about regulations to control HAPs? We can combine these objectively measured risk reductions with studies that value cancer risks. There has been talk about the aspects of risk that matter to people, the fact that cancer is a dreaded disease. It's dreaded, as Dick Zeckhauser was telling us yesterday, because of what it does to you before you die. There are also side effects of treatment. And in terms of people's dread of the disease, this is something that we do want to capture in terms of people's preferences. And there is a growing literature, a growing stated preference literature that is measuring how much more somebody would pay to reduce their risk of contracting a fatal cancer than they would of dying in an auto accident or dying of a heart attack or something not so dreaded. As I said, I think this does suggest a preference for stated preference studies, although indeed there are some good revealed preference studies where I think the issue of what it is people are actually valuing is addressed. The example here, a study by Lucas Davis in the 2004 AER, used information on a pediatric cancer cluster in Nevada and data on property values in that county and also in a control county, a very carefully done study to look at the value of avoiding a case of leukemia among children. But I think if you think about, generally speaking, going to the literature and saying, well, we're just going to look at the impact of, say, changes in toxic releases according to TRI on property values, I think you really have some problems. A very nicely done study that uses this approach is one that was actually commissioned under the Section 812 studies by EPA. It's a study of the impacts of reducing benzene in Houston. It looks at the benefits of reducing benzene emissions from all titles of the Clean Air of the 1990 amendments that would reduce emissions, not just Title III. It doesn't look at costs, but it does a very good job at measuring benefits. And one of the things that we have to admit here is that the reductions that are predicted to occur over the period of the study, which is the 30-year period, are small. The reductions in leukemia cases delivered from benzene emission reductions are 7 fatal and 6 non-fatal cases over this 30-year period. And the net present value of the benefits of reducing benzene emissions, at least for this particular health endpoint, are $30 million. Okay, this is using a 5% discount rate, $2,006. So this is a situation where benefit cost analysis says something about the efficiency of the regulation. It also, though, says if we're concerned about equity issues, what should we do? And so the issue, I think, is, how do we deal with equity? One thing we could do is to try to elicit people's altruistic preferences. Now, economists have said for years that the nature of altruism really matters in terms of whether you want to take it into account in a benefit cost analysis. If people are pure altruists, if person A cares about person B's reduction in risk of cancer, but he also realizes that if we regulate more stringently, it's going to reduce B's consumption of other goods, and if A respects B's preferences, then indeed B's rate of substitution between cancer risk and money is what we should be measuring in the benefit cost analysis. We don't want to add person A's willingness to pay to that. But if we allow people to be paternalistic altruists, if I care about person B's cancer risk, but I don't care about their consumption of other goods, we could ask people what they would pay to reduce cancer risks to disadvantaged people. We could incorporate that into a benefit cost analysis. We could also do that and still supplement benefit cost analysis with information about the distribution of risks across the population. John Levy has popularized the notion of using an Atkinson index, an index that goes from 0, which indicates total equality of the distribution of whatever it is, to 1, where it's total inequality. A Gini coefficient would be a comparable measure. We could provide information about that for risks of cancer from exposure to HAPs. The question is whether you want to monetize something like a distributional measure such as the Atkinson index. And what I've said here is, you want to be careful what you ask people to value. If people really understood well the notion of the distribution of risks, the actual absolute level of risks and how they're distributed in the population, it would be one thing to ask them to value that. In the case of something like the Atkinson index, which is scale independent, okay, I'm just about out of here, I think you have to be really careful. I mean, when I say it's scale independent, the absolute level of risks to which people are subject is not part of the index. So just to conclude, I do think that benefit cost analysis can be useful in identifying efficient and inefficient policy. I do take the normative approach. I also think that it is important to compute distributional measures. I do think that in using revealed preference studies, which actually are the basis for a lot of valuation currently, especially in terms of the value of a statistical life, it is important to talk about whether people are really accurately perceiving health effects, and I think you have to be careful how you incorporate equity into the analysis.
Okay, we now have some opportunities for questions for the panelists. First, I'd like the panelists to come up to the podium. Secondly, we're going to use the queuing method that we used yesterday. So if you take your place in the line there, you can pose your questions. Just give a few minutes for the panelists to assemble here. Okay, first question. And please identify yourself.
Roger Cook, Resources for the Future. I have a question for Jim Hammett, and this is a true story. A small community similar to Happyville was going to put fluoride in their water. And the science said pretty clearly that this was a good thing. There was a very vocal minority that opposed it, and they saw this as socialized medicine and a communist conspiracy and so on. And so the community voted to put the fluoride in. Then there were discussions about compensation. Should the naysayers be given free fluoride-free water, or should the yay-sayers be allowed or be given fluoride pills that they could put in their own water, and so on and so on? What they actually did was this. They announced they were going to put the fluoride in on the 1st of January, say, and then they didn't put it in. And they received a lot of complaints that my canary died and my teeth fell out and my toilet is green and so on. And they waited until all those complaints sort of petered out, and then they put it in. So my question is this a paternalistic attitude? Is this revealed preference? What and would this be legal in the current regime? If you care to comment.
So I think that's a wonderful story.
Speak to the microphone, please.
I am.
Oh, you are? Okay.
That's a great story. So it highlights that we face these issues, and neither extreme is the right way to behave, plus the distributional issue here. We had different people with different opinions. Sort of one thing I would say is generally part of the answer should be better education, better information, but I'm troubled there in that. So one version is we might be persuaded people should maximize expected utility, but educating people to follow expected utility is quite a large task to get them to really internalize it. And how confident are we that that really is the right thing for them to be doing? Essentially, what's the line between education, information, and training, or ultimately brainwashing?
Hi, I also wanted to revisit Happyville
identify
for a
yourself,
minute.
please.
Sorry. Robert Burt, OSHA. I also wanted to revisit Happyville for a minute. And it seemed to me there are some distinctions left out in this, so far in this positive and normative distinction. Let me make one. Let us suppose the people in Happyville, in fact, are spending $1,000 per person bringing in bottled water. And you can treat this water for $500 per person. It would seem to me offhand that there's a pretty good case for treating this water for $500 per person, even and acknowledge it. But you could turn it around and say, suppose there's absolutely nothing the people can do about this, and further, they don't have any dread or anxiety element. They're just afraid they'll die sooner. You know they won't. They will, in fact, be happier if you deny them the treatment and let them keep the $1,000. The broad point here is there's a number of kinds of distinctions that affect this. What people can and are doing in the absence of the government action, what kinds of things, the strength of the and nature of the opinion people have. I mean, you could elicit from me an opinion about the safety of Chesapeake Bay rockfish, but it's not something I act on, think about, or would want anyone to act on or think about. I would prefer an expert judgment. So there's a whole set of distinctions here that I think need some work. I
agree. I agree.
Rick Belzer, Regulatory Checkbook. I'm interested in this discussion because there seems to be a disconnect between Happyville and the distinction between positive and normative economics made here, and what I recall from my 10 years in a different little town called Oiraville. And in Oiraville, there weren't 1,000, there were 3 up to 5 economists, depending on whether the branch chiefs were behaving as branch chiefs or behaving as economists. Nothing personal. But I cannot recall an instance in which the culture of OIRA accepted the notion that our job, or anyone's job, was to decide what people ought to prefer. The strongest normative value that I recall being expressed was, could we imagine what decisions people would make if they were as informed as we are? based on their preferences, but I cannot recall a situation where we attempted to subordinate our preferences for theirs. And therein lies the large form of conflict between the OIRA professional staff historically, it may have changed in 10 years, and agency staff, where agency staff seem to be very much driven toward the idea of attempting to get people to behave the way they ought to behave, as opposed to respecting individual preferences as they come. And that's a very big gulf when you're thinking about revising the executive order and the analysis that would go along with it. That the OIRA culture is a peculiar one that is neither populist nor paternalistic, as Jim had put the trade-off. It's strongly libertarian, which is really, really different.
Yeah, just quickly. So I agree that the standard has to be something like estimating the preferences of people if they had correct information and adequate information. But there's still a lot of work to figure out exactly what that would mean and how to get that.
And adequate information may not be enough if people's choices are biased in other ways. And I want to call attention to a problem I have with the word preference, which really has two meanings in this kind of discussion. One is what people actually choose, and the other is the word is sometimes used as a standard for what's good for people. And those are different things, or they may be different things.
Let me just comment. In the medical context, this comes up all the time. So you've got a treatment that some people like and other people don't, and there are paternalistic doctors who try to tell you what to do, but that approach has been, I'd say, more or less rejected by most patients and increasingly by doctors as well. And so the answer is you try to provide the information and do your best to inform people and let them make choices whenever possible. And sometimes patients say, I don't want to choose, in which case you probably tell them what you do, and then they make their decision anyway.
Kerry Smith from Arizona State and Resources for the Future. I want to go back to Happyville as well and to Maureen's comments and then related to some of the panel. Everybody in Happyville was well informed. That was part of the scenario. And yet we're rejecting their choice, if I understood you correctly, Maureen. So I guess the question that I have for all of the folks on the panel is who decides? That is, to me, when we talk about what economics is about and about the preferences that we're talking about when we discuss consumer sovereignty, we're really just talking about choices. Economics never assumes, except as a shorthand, that there is some true set of preferences. All we really know are the choices that people make, and then we as analysts try to take those choices and say, are they coherent in the sense that they obey some axioms that we as analysts attribute to coherent preferences. But what we really know are choices that people make. That's it. So if we're going to say these are good choices and others are bad choices, then how are we going to choose an expert to decide what are the good or bad choices since we're all flawed in some dimension?
Well, I mean, Kerry, there are two reasons here for, how shall we put it, for regulating. I mean, one is the point that I made about the fact that people are imperfectly informed, but then, of course, the bigger reason is that you can't have, how shall I say it, Coasian bargaining when you're talking about setting the level of benzene or sulfur in gasoline. I mean, it's something that has to be done at the national level. I mean, clearly you could get out of the Happyville example by saying, well, this is a small community. They're going to decide by democratic means, and even though I would, if I were, I don't know, the mayor of Happyville, try to inform people. It's a different situation. I mean, it's also a very different situation in a doctor-patient situation where you can tailor the treatment to the patient. I think that what you're trying to do in situations where, for better or for worse, everyone is going to be subject to the same regulation is to do exactly what Rick said, which is I think you're trying to unfortunately, you've got to somehow aggregate preferences, and you're trying to aggregate the preferences that people would have if they were well informed.
Just a quick comment. I don't agree that all we have are people's choices. We also have their judgments. And you can say that that's just fluff, but a lot of us don't think that.
So I want to make two comments. The first one is, there's the world of sort of first best and then second best. And, in healthcare, the problem, of course, is no one's paying for anything most of the time. So, except in the long run, right? So, looking at choices to inform values is, almost always a mistake alone. The second thing I just want to comment about is I think in all these issues about methods and cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis, the sort of litmus test in the end is how large are these effects, and can you put any sort of value on them quantitatively? I once sat across the dinner table from Ken Arrow, and he was telling literally war stories of how he got involved in cost-effectiveness or in policy analysis and economics, predicting the weather for D-Day and all this great stuff. And then he asks me what I do, and I very sheepishly explain I do cost-effectiveness analysis, and I know his theorem proves it doesn't mean anything, and I hope to sort of skulk away. And anyway, what he basically said is, sometimes you just have to predict the weather. You got to make a decision. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, are these things small problems or large problems, and challenge ourselves to put numbers on them and say, is this a big problem or a little problem? Because we got to do something.
I'm Arnold Kuzmak, currently retired but a former EPA employee. I think the information quotes that people have or their impressions of reality tend to be drawn from sort of a cultural milieu rather than from analyzing scientific data and so forth that we like to think that we know how to do. And a good example of that is David Meltzer's case of pregnant women should avoid eating fish, with the exception of some very rare, highly contaminated fish. Almost everybody would agree that's the wrong choice, but it is sort of out there, and people probably tend to follow it.
Is there a question?
If anybody has a reaction to that.
I'm Sandy Hoffman from Resources for the Future. This is mostly for Jonathan Barron, and a comment and a question. The comment is, or actually maybe it's a question. In talking about avoiding inequality bias and some of the other biases, it strikes me that what you're talking about is literally a bias in the sense that we talk about bias in statistical analysis, that there's an omitted variable, and that biases are other coefficients. So I'm wondering, it seems to me like that, particularly in a conjoint setting where we're looking at a good as a set of attributes, that inequality is one of the attributes that people may care about, and we may want to measure that. And then that it's important to separate the value that people place on avoiding inequality from the value they place on reducing risk, and perhaps from different types of risk attitudes. And so it's an issue of how do we develop appropriate measures for for separating those attributes.
Well, from the point of view of consequences alone, inequality is a means, not an end. That is, inequality is bad because the utility of poor people for money is because you can increase utility by giving more money to poor people, other things being equal, or something like that. And so we would care, from a utilitarian point of view, would care about inequality because of its consequences. But if people judge inequality in other ways, then that in ways that actually lower total utility, then that's a bias. From the point of view, it's a bias in the sense that it produces worse consequences. So there's sort of two. I don't know if that's an answer, but I don't think. It seems to me that including a dimension for preference for avoiding inequality is exactly what I was talking about that should be avoided in a consequentialist decision analysis. You want to get that stuff out of it and focus on the consequences alone. You can do that if you want, but then it's not telling you about the consequences.
So you're suggesting, if I'm understanding this right, then you're suggesting that, say, the choice of the social ordering, the social welfare function, which says something about inequality not being, that a transfer to poorer people, which is essentially, a utilitarian social welfare function, that should be a normative decision at the societal level that we reach through a political mechanism rather than something that we try to measure.
Well, I was suggesting that it's part of the decision analysis that's supposed to yield a second opinion, and then if the political decision makers want to come and add something else, that's their prerogative. So.
Howard Kundruther from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. This is a question on framing for the panel. We've been spending a lot of time, certainly yesterday, and I think it came up partly today, on the fact that people have a very hard time dealing with probabilities. And there's anecdotal evidence from a number of experiments that you put a probability on one level, you may get a very different response on willingness to pay than another. Just one little example to highlight that. You tell people there's a 1 in 100 chance of a flood next year, or you tell them there's a 1 in 5 chance of at least one flood in the next 25 years, and you get a very, very different response in their willingness to pay, how much they're willing to protect themselves, and what to do. So I'd be interested in getting comments on how you deal with this issue of presenting information in different forms and communicating information, and what do we do then when we get very different willingness to pays on the basis of just providing that information in that very simple form, exact same data but presented in a different way?
I think this kind of relates to part of what Carrie said, actually, that what we have is choices and statements about choices and surveys and so forth, and we try and impose some structure on them through utility functions, and we'd like to ensure that they're consistent. Maureen also talked about it's important when people are valuing things to demonstrate that they actually understand what it is they're valuing. So I think it's kind of a illuminate the truth by triangulation kind of thing. You have to measure the same concept in different ways, see how repeatable it is, how consistent across people and the like, but it's a very hard problem, as you know.
I mean, just one small thing. We've done some willingness to pay studies in medicine looking at people's willingness to pay to have their own doctor care for them in the hospital. And one of the techniques that we found very useful is to randomize people to different forms of questions and then understand how those different forms of questions lead to different answers. And in that case, what we discovered is the apparent differences between two ways of framing something were due to the tail of the distribution, where something in essence was top-coded. And people wouldn't pay more than the most you asked them to pay. And once you dealt with that problem, you solved it. But obviously, neither of those could be the true number. It's just one example of the many biases, and at least it's one strategy you can think about when you can pinpoint a type of bias.
In a world with perfect information, the reason we still regulate is because individual choices bear societal externalities. And I think that that's exactly why I agree with Maureen that the normative benefit cost analysis is the one that we need to go with. That the existence of the externalities require us as regulators to be bringing some correct analysis of at least what the benefits and cost to people other than that person who says, gee, this is what I'd like to do, wants done in making the decision.
Yeah, can I jump in on that? So I agree and disagree. And let me focus on the part where I disagree, which is the concept that there's a normative analysis. The problem is that there are many normative analysis, and it's sort of whose. And let me give you a beautiful example of this from diabetes. If you read every published study of diabetes cost effectiveness up until the time we started doing this, not one of them included any disutility associated with treatment. Why? Because they were all developed by endocrinologists who were like, go take the insulin, do the shots, whatever, but they don't have to do it, right? And what we did is we looked and did a revealed preference study that showed that when you look at people's real choices, the people who don't like these treatments don't choose them. And what's the failure of recognizing that? You don't develop treatments that are more tolerable for people, right? And you don't get people choosing the right things. So I think the answer is that there isn't just one or the other. You really need both, and they need to play with each other. And you probably need a normative framework, but it should be informed by sort of positive analysis that helps you develop it. One idea.
I think this will be the last question.
Hi, Pat Cassano, GE Corporate Environmental Programs. My question is for Dr. Cropper. You stated a fairly strong preference for stated preference studies and made a fairly strong statement, it seemed to me at the end, that revealed preference shouldn't be used unless people have good information. But stated preference surveys have lots of studies, have lots of problems associated with them as well. And so I'm wondering, I guess, do you think that the lack of information in the revealed preference context is a bigger problem than the other problems with stated preference studies? Or
well, okay. I mean, the two things that people don't emphasize with revealed preference, I mean, people always say, okay, stated preference is hypothetical, and there are problems with that. The problem with, or the difficulties with revealed preference is that, first of all, you're teasing numbers out of a statistical analysis that really is based on a lot of assumptions. I mean, this is not the appropriate place to discuss this, but for example, to actually figure out what the impact of the cancer cluster is on property values, I mean, really requires a lot of careful analysis, and it's possibly sensitive to assumptions that the analyst is making. The same thing with wage risk studies. And in fact, about 6 years ago, EPA commissioned Dan Black, a respected labor economist with no interests in regulation, to look at wage risk studies and see if the results were robust. And his conclusion at the end was that the results should not be used for policy because they're too sensitive to the assumptions that are used, and also to measurement error and all sorts of things. And so I think there's that problem, and then there's also the problem of, we don't often test in revealed preference studies that we're measuring what we think we're measuring. In other words, it could be the case that risks on the job, which we assume to match the objective ones, are picking up something else. We don't do enough of this checking of the fact that, in fact, what the analyst is putting in the equation is actually what people are perceiving.
Hearing no further comment or question, I think I can declare the session closed.